My name is Beulah, and I'm 52 years old. This morning, I'm sitting in my little apartment here in Arizona, watching the sun paint the desert mountains gold while I sip my coffee. It's been 6 months since I left that house in Ohio, where I'd lived for 30 years. 6 months since I walked away from everything I thought defined me. People always ask what made me finally leave what was the final straw that broke this old camel's back. Well, it wasn't what you might expect. Sometimes the most painful truths come wrapped in the cruelest words, and sometimes those words become the greatest gift you never knew you needed. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who's ever felt invisible in your own family? Drop a comment below and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from. And if this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe, because I have a feeling you're going to want to hear how this journey of rediscovering myself unfolds. Trust me, what happened after I disappeared will surprise you just as much as it surprised my daughter. You see, I wasn't always the woman sitting here in Arizona free as a bird and twice as happy. For the longest time, I was Beulah the widow, Beulah the devoted mother, Beulah the unpaid nanny. My husband Robert passed from lung cancer back in 2019, and Lord, that man was the love of my life. We'd built everything together in that little house on Maple Street in Dayton, Ohio. After he died, I felt like half of me had been buried with him. The only thing that kept me going was our daughter Samantha and her family. Samantha was 28, married to a man named Derek, and they had two beautiful babies, Emma, who was 5, and little Lucas, who just turned 3. After Robert's funeral, I made what I thought was the right choice. I sold our big family home, the one with too many memories and too many empty rooms, and bought a smaller place just 15 minutes from Samantha's house. I wanted to be close to help to matter. I threw myself into being the best grandmother and mother I could be. When Derek lost his job at the manufacturing plant, I was there with casseroles and encouragement. When Samantha went back to work as a dental hygienist, I became their free childcare. Every morning at 7:30, I'd drive over with breakfast already made, get the kids dressed, and stay until Derek got home from whatever part-time job he could find. I paid for Emma's dance lessons and Lucas's daycare when money was tight. I bought their groceries when Derek's unemployment ran out. I spent my weekends cleaning their house and meal prepping for the week ahead. I used my savings to fix their broken washing machine, their leaky roof, their old car that kept breaking down. In my mind, this was what family did. This was how love looked. But looking back now, I can see the warning signs I chose to ignore. Samantha stopped saying thank you somewhere along the way. When I'd arrive at their house, she'd barely look up from her phone to acknowledge me. Derek treated me like hired help, never making eye contact, never asking how I was doing. The kids loved me. That was never in question, but even they started treating my presence as a given rather than a gift. The first real crack in my rose-colored glasses came on my 51st birthday last year. I'd bought myself a small cake, nothing fancy, just hoping we could celebrate together as a family. When I got to their house that evening, Samantha and Derek were getting ready to go out to dinner. They'd gotten a babysitter, they said, because they needed adult time. They left me there with Emma and Lucas, not even remembering it was my birthday until I was already in my car crying in their driveway. That night, I ate grocery store cake alone while watching cartoons with my grandchildren, wondering when I'd become so forgettable. The disrespect didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly like water through a crack in the foundation until one day I realized I was drowning in it. The first major incident happened in February when I caught the flu. I mean, really caught it, the kind that leaves you dizzy and weak and barely able to stand. I called Samantha early that Tuesday morning, my voice hoarse and barely a whisper, to let her know I couldn't make it over to watch the kids. You'd have thought I'd told her the world was ending. She went off on me about how she had an important client meeting that day, how her boss was already questioning her reliability since she'd had to leave early the month before when Lucas had strep throat. She said I was being inconsiderate, that a little cold wasn't an excuse to let the family down. I tried to explain that this wasn't just a cold that I could barely keep water down, but she'd already hung up on me. An hour later, she called back. She'd found a way to reschedule her meeting, she said, but I owed her big time. The guilt ate at me all day. By evening, even though I was running a fever of 102, I dragged myself over there to watch Emma and Lucas while they went to Derek's company dinner. I ended up passing out in their kitchen around 9 p.m. and waking up in the emergency room with severe dehydration. Samantha's first words when she got to the hospital weren't asking if I was okay. They were complaints about how much the ambulance was going to cost and how Derek had to leave his work event early. The second major blow came in April. Derek had lost another job, his third in 2 years this time, for showing up late too many times. Samantha came to me with tears in her eyes, explaining they were behind on their mortgage and might lose the house. She needed $20,000 just temporarily, just until Derek could find something stable. My retirement savings weren't huge, but Robert had been careful with money and I had enough to help. I didn't hesitate. I withdrew $20,000 from my IRA, took the tax penalty, and handed it over the same day. Samantha hugged me and promised they'd pay me back within 6 months. 2 weeks later, Derek pulled into their driveway with a brand new pickup truck. When I asked Samantha about it, she got defensive, saying Derek needed reliable transportation for job interviews. That $20,000 truck never helped him find work, and I never saw a penny of my money returned. But the thing that really broke my heart was how invisible I'd become in my own family. During their dinner parties, I was the woman who stayed in the kitchen cleaning dishes and refilling drinks while they entertained their friends. When I'd try to join conversations, Derek would check his phone or suddenly remember he needed another beer. Samantha would give me that look, the one that said I was embarrassing her somehow just by existing in the space. I started to notice how they talked around me like I wasn't there. Discussions about vacation plans, about moving to a bigger house, about Derek's job prospects, all happened as if I was furniture. When Emma would run to me with scraped knees or hurt feelings, Samantha would redirect her to come to Mommy instead. When Lucas wanted me to read him bedtime stories, Derek would say it was time for Grandma to go home. I was giving everything I had, every dollar, every hour, every piece of my heart, and somehow I was still not enough. Worse than that, I was becoming a burden they tolerated rather than a blessing they cherished. I'd wake up some mornings and not recognize the woman in the mirror. Where had Beulah gone? When had I become this desperate creature begging for scraps of affection from my own daughter? The loneliness was crushing. I'd given up my book club to be available for babysitting. I'd stopped going to church socials because weekends were family time. I'd lost touch with neighbors and old friends because my world had shrunk to the size of Samantha's needs. I was surrounded by family but felt more alone than I ever had, even in those first dark months after Robert died. November arrived with the kind of crisp Ohio air that used to fill me with excitement for the holidays. This particular November was supposed to be special because I'd been planning our family Thanksgiving for weeks. I'd saved up money from my part-time job at the medical office to buy a 20-pound turkey, all the trimmings, and enough food to feed an army. I spent 3 days preparing, making Emma's favorite green bean casserole from scratch and Lucas's beloved sweet potato marshmallow surprise. My little house smelled like heaven. I'd pulled out Robert's grandmother's china, the set we'd only used for special occasions, and set the dining room table with the good silverware and cloth napkins. I'd even driven to 3 different stores to find the specific cranberry sauce that Derek preferred, the kind with whole berries that cost twice as much as the regular stuff. Emma and Lucas had been talking about Thanksgiving at Grandma's house for weeks. Emma had made hand turkey decorations at school that she wanted to show me, and Lucas had been practicing saying the blessing he'd learned in his preschool class. I'd promised them pumpkin pie and apple pie, and I'd stayed up until midnight the night before making sure everything was perfect. That Thursday morning, I was pulling the turkey out of the oven when my phone rang. It was Samantha, and I could hear the kids chattering in the background. My heart swelled with anticipation. They were probably calling to ask what time to come over, maybe to see if they could bring anything last minute. Instead, Samantha dropped a bomb that shattered my entire holiday. She told me they'd decided to go to Derek's parents' house for Thanksgiving instead. His mother had hired a caterer, she explained, and they wanted to do something more formal this year, something more sophisticated. She said it like those were good things, like the love and labor I'd poured into our meal was somehow inferior to store-bought elegance. I stood there in my kitchen looking at enough food to feed 10 people, listening to my daughter tell me that my efforts weren't good enough. I asked as calmly as I could manage if perhaps I could bring some of the dishes I'd made to share at Derek's parents' house. Maybe the sweet potato casserole the kids loved, or the stuffing I'd made from Robert's mother's recipe. Samantha's response was quick and cutting. She said Derek's mother had already planned the menu with her caterer, and they didn't want to complicate things with extra dishes. She made it sound like my homemade food would be an imposition, an embarrassment to their upscale celebration. I felt my heart cracking, but I tried one more time. I asked if they could maybe stop by after dinner just for dessert, so the kids could see what Grandma had made for them. I could hear Derek in the background saying something, and then Samantha's voice got that edge to it, the one that meant she was losing patience with me. That's when the conversation took the turn that would change everything. I made the mistake of letting my hurt show. I told her that I'd spent days preparing and a lot of money I really couldn't afford, and that I'd been looking forward to having the family together. I said I felt like she was pulling the rug out from under me at the last minute. Samantha's response was like ice water in my veins. She said I was being dramatic, that it was just a dinner, and that I needed to stop making everything about me. She said I was acting needy and clingy, and that Derek's family had the right idea about doing things properly instead of settling for ordinary. But then came the words that would echo in my head for months afterward. She looked me straight in the eyes, this daughter I'd given my whole life to, and said with the coldest voice I'd ever heard from her, "Honestly, Mom, if you disappeared tomorrow, no one would really miss you. You act like we can't function without you, but we managed just fine before you became so needy." The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the feast I'd prepared with love, wearing the apron Robert had given me for our last Christmas together. And I felt something inside me break and heal at the same time. Those words meant to wound me instead, set me free. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't defend myself or point out all the ways they'd depended on me. I just looked at my daughter, this stranger who'd somehow replaced the little girl I'd raised, and said very quietly, "I understand." Then I walked them to the door, hugged Emma and Lucas like it might be the last time, and watched them drive away to their sophisticated Thanksgiving. As their car disappeared down my street, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt curious about what would happen if I actually took Samantha's advice. What if I did disappear? What if I found out whether anyone would really miss me? The house felt different after they left. Not empty exactly, but peaceful in a way it hadn't been for a long time. I walked through my dining room looking at the table set for a family that wasn't coming, and instead of feeling sorry for myself, I felt something unexpected. I felt relieved. I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and really looked around my home for the first time in months. When had everything become about what Samantha and Derek needed? When had I stopped living my own life and started existing solely as an extension of theirs? Samantha's cruel words had accidentally shown me a truth I'd been avoiding. I had become someone who could disappear without being missed because I'd forgotten how to be worth missing. That night I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to test Samantha's theory. I was going to disappear and see what happened, but I wasn't going to do it with drama or tearful confrontations or guilt trips. I was going to do it quietly, gracefully, and completely. The next morning I started making phone calls. The first one was to my sister Janet in Phoenix. Janet was 2 years younger than me and had been widowed around the same time as me, but she'd handled it differently. She'd sold her house in Michigan and moved to a senior community in Arizona, where she'd made new friends, taken up painting, and started line dancing. She'd been inviting me to visit for years, always saying there was a little apartment available in her complex if I ever wanted a change of scenery. When I called Janet and asked if the invitation was still open, she squealed with delight. She said the apartment next to hers had just become available, and she'd been hoping I'd finally take her up on her offer. Within an hour, she'd called me back with details about rent move-in dates and how excited she was to have me close by. The next call was harder. I contacted a real estate agent and put my house on the market. The agent, a young woman named Patricia, was amazed at how clean and well-maintained everything was. She said it would sell quickly, probably within a week, because starter homes in good neighborhoods were in high demand. She was right. By the following Wednesday, I had 3 offers over asking price. I spent the next few days quietly packing my life into boxes. It was remarkable how little I actually needed when I really thought about it. Clothes, a few pieces of jewelry Robert had given me, some photos, my grandmother's quilt, and a handful of books. Everything else was just stuff, things I'd accumulated because I thought they mattered. I opened a new bank account in Arizona and had my Social Security and pension payments redirected there. I changed my address with the post office, updated my voter registration, and transferred my medical records. I did all of this without telling Samantha, without asking her opinion or permission. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based solely on what I wanted. The hardest part was writing the letter. I must have started it 20 times before I finally got it right. I didn't want it to be angry or accusatory. I didn't want to blame or shame. I just wanted to be honest. The final version was simple and direct. Samantha, you said no one would miss me if I disappeared. I've decided to test that theory. I'm starting a new chapter of my life where I matter to someone, where my presence is a gift rather than a burden. I hope you find the independence you seem to want so badly. Take care of those beautiful children. Love always, Mom. I put the letter on the kitchen counter along with the house keys and the paperwork from the sale. I also left wrapped Christmas presents for Emma and Lucas, toys I'd been collecting for months, along with savings bonds I'd started for their college educations. If no one was going to miss me, at least I could leave with a clear conscience. December 12th was a Tuesday, and it dawned clear and cold in Ohio. I'd been awake since 5 a.m., not from nerves, but from excitement. I'd forgotten what it felt like to anticipate something just for myself, to have plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or schedules. I made myself a proper breakfast for the first time in months, not just coffee and toast grabbed between, rushing to help with one crisis or another. I sat at my kitchen table eating scrambled eggs and watching the sunrise through the window above my sink. The snow was just starting to fall, light flakes that reminded me of the morning Robert and I had moved into this house 30 years ago. We'd been so young then, so full of dreams about the life we'd build together. Before I loaded my car, I took one last walk through each room. In the living room, I touched the mantel where our wedding photo used to sit before I'd packed it away. In the bedroom, I smoothed the quilt on the bed one final time. In what had been Samantha's room, I stood in the doorway remembering the little girl who used to have tea parties there with her stuffed animals, who'd run to me for comfort after nightmares, who'd once told me I was the best mommy in the whole world. But that little girl was gone, replaced by a woman who saw me as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. And maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time for both of us to grow up and figure out who we were without each other. I placed the letter and house keys on the kitchen counter next to the Christmas gifts. For a moment, I wondered if I should call, if I should give Samantha one last chance to say she was sorry that she'd been wrong. But then I remembered her cold eyes when she'd told me no one would miss me, and I knew this was the right choice. Some lessons can only be learned through consequences. The drive to Arizona took me 3 days, and they were the most peaceful days I'd had in years. I drove through Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, stopping in small towns I'd never heard of, eating at local diners, staying in clean but simple motels. In a truck stop in Kansas, an elderly man complimented my smile and asked if I was traveling to see family. I realized it was the first time in months that anyone had noticed me as a person rather than as someone's mother or grandmother. At a diner in New Mexico, I sat next to a woman named Susan, who was also traveling alone. She was visiting her daughter in California, she said, but this time she was staying in a hotel instead of with the family because she'd learned that a little distance made their visits more pleasant for everyone. We talked for an hour about books, about travel, about the freedom of making decisions without having to consider anyone else's feelings. It was the most adult conversation I'd had in years. When I finally pulled into Janet's apartment complex in Phoenix, I felt like I was arriving at the promised land. Janet came running out to meet me, her silver hair gleaming in the desert sun, her face tanned and relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since we were girls. She hugged me tight and said, "Welcome home, sister. Your new life starts now." That first night in my little one-bedroom apartment, I sat on the small balcony looking out at the desert mountains and felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert died. I felt hopeful. Not hopeful that someone would need me or that I could make myself useful to someone else, but hopeful for my own future, my own possibilities, my own happiness. The first week in Arizona passed like a dream I didn't want to wake up from. I'd turned off my old phone and gotten a new number one that only Janet had. I wanted to see what it felt like to exist without the constant possibility of crisis calls, without being on standby for other people's emergencies. I spent my mornings walking the trails around the apartment complex, something I'd never had time for in Ohio. The desert was beautiful in a way that surprised me, not lush and green like Ohio, but stark and honest and somehow healing. I'd pack a small thermos of coffee and walk for an hour watching the sunrise paint the mountains different colors, listening to the silence that was so complete it felt like music. In the afternoons, I'd explore Phoenix with Janet or sometimes by myself. I went to museums. I'd never had time for art galleries where I could stand and stare at paintings as long as I wanted without anyone asking when we could leave. I bought books at a used bookstore and read them cover to cover without interruption. I discovered that I actually enjoyed cooking when I was doing it for pleasure rather than obligation. But the real revelation came at the end of my second week when I was in the laundry room and met my neighbor Frank. He was a retired high school English teacher, a widower like me, with kind eyes and a sense of humor that reminded me of Robert. When he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime, I said yes without thinking about whether it was appropriate or what anyone would think. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, the consequences of my absence were becoming impossible to ignore. Samantha hadn't noticed anything was wrong for the first 3 days. She was used to me being available, but not necessarily present, if that makes sense. It wasn't until Thursday, when I didn't show up for my usual babysitting duties, that she started to worry. She called my old number repeatedly, getting increasingly frustrated when it went straight to a message saying the number was no longer in service. She drove to my house and found it empty, with a for sale sign in the yard showing "sold" across it in big red letters. That's when she found my letter on the kitchen counter. Janet told me later that Samantha had called her in a panic, demanding to know where I was and how she could reach me. Janet, bless her heart, told Samantha that I was safe and well, but that I'd made it clear I needed time and space to figure things out. She wouldn't give Samantha my new number, not yet. The practical realities hit Samantha's household like a freight train. Derek had to take time off work to handle childcare arrangements, which his boss didn't appreciate since he'd already used most of his personal days earlier in the year. They had to hire a babysitter at $15 an hour, which meant an extra $300 a week coming out of their already tight budget. More importantly, Emma and Lucas were heartbroken. They kept asking where Grandma was, why she wasn't coming to see them anymore when she was coming back. Samantha found herself trying to explain to 2 small children why the most consistent adult in their lives had suddenly disappeared, and she couldn't do it without admitting that she'd driven me away. Derek, who had never appreciated my help when he had it, was now furious about having to manage household responsibilities he'd taken for granted. The laundry piled up meals became drive-through affairs, and the house that I'd kept clean and organized descended into chaos. He started taking his frustration out on Samantha, blaming her for whatever she'd done to make me leave. But I knew none of this yet. I was too busy rediscovering who Beulah was when she wasn't defined by other people's needs. I joined a watercolor class at the community center and discovered I had a talent for painting desert landscapes. I volunteered at the local library, helping seniors learn to use computers, and felt useful in a way that fed my soul instead of draining it. 3 months into my new life, Frank and I had become close friends, and maybe something a little more. He was gentle and patient, interested in my thoughts and opinions, appreciative of my company in a way that felt completely different from being needed. When he told me I was beautiful, I believed him because he had no ulterior motives, no hidden agenda that required my services. It was March when Samantha finally tracked down my new phone number through Janet. The first call came on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner for Frank and myself, something I'd started doing twice a week because I enjoyed his company and he appreciated my cooking. When I saw an Ohio number I didn't recognize, my first instinct was not to answer. But something, maybe mother's intuition or maybe just curiosity, made me pick up. Samantha's voice was barely a whisper, shaky with tears I could hear even across the miles. "Mom," she said, and I could hear years of regret packed into that one word. "Hello, Samantha," I replied, surprised by how calm I felt. The sound of her voice didn't send me into the familiar panic of wondering what crisis needed solving or what emergency required my immediate attention. What followed was the conversation we should have had years ago, but never could because I'd been too busy enabling her, and she'd been too comfortable taking advantage of my love. She cried, really cried, for the first time since she'd been a little girl. She told me about the chaos my absence had created, but more importantly, she told me about the emptiness. "The kids ask about you every day," she sobbed. "Emma made you a Mother's Day card even though you're not here. Lucas still sets a place for you at dinner sometimes. And I miss you too, Mom. I miss you so much it hurts." But I'd learned something important during my months in Arizona. I'd learned the difference between being missed and being needed, between being loved and being used. So instead of rushing to comfort her, instead of immediately forgiving and forgetting, I asked her a question that surprised us both. "What do you miss about me?" "Samantha, do you miss the person I am, or do you miss the things I did for you?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She was thinking, really thinking, maybe for the first time in years, about who I was beyond my usefulness to her family. When she finally answered, her voice was different, smaller, more honest. "I think I miss both," she said. "But I realize now that I never really knew the person you are because I was so focused on what you could do for me, and that's not fair. That's not love. That's just selfish." Over the following weeks, we talked several more times. Real conversations where she asked about my life, my happiness, my new interests. She wanted to know about Arizona, about my painting classes, about Frank. She seemed genuinely interested in my answers, not just waiting for her turn to talk about her own problems. She told me about the financial strain my absence had caused, but she also told me about the growth it had forced. Derek had learned to appreciate household management in a way he never had before. The kids had become more independent, more helpful around the house. Samantha herself had discovered reserves of patience and capability she didn't know she possessed. Most importantly, she apologized. Not just for the cruel words she'd said on Thanksgiving, but for years of taking me for granted, for treating my sacrifices as expectations rather than gifts, for making me feel invisible in my own family. "I understand now," she said during one of our calls. "You didn't disappear to hurt us. You disappeared to save yourself, and maybe to save us too from becoming people who could treat someone we love so badly." I appreciated her apology, and I forgave her because that's what mothers do. But I also made it clear that forgiveness didn't mean returning to the old patterns. I was building a life in Arizona, I explained. I was happy here, needed here, valued here for who I was, rather than what I could provide. If she wanted me to be part of her family's life going forward, it would have to be as an equal participant, not as unpaid staff. My time had value, my presence was a gift, and my feelings mattered. If she could accept those terms, we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The healing process was slow, careful, and honest in a way our relationship had never been before. We video called twice a week so I could see the children and they could see that Grandma was happy and healthy in her new home. Samantha started sending me photos and updates not because she needed something, but because she wanted to include me in their lives. When summer came, they visited me in Arizona for a week. It was the first time in years that I'd been excited rather than anxious about spending extended time with them. Derek was polite and respectful, actually thanking me when I cooked meals or helped with the children. The kids were fascinated by the desert, by my apartment, by Frank, who charmed them with stories about his teaching days and helped Emma with an art project. Most remarkably, Samantha seemed to see me differently. She noticed when I got my hair cut, complimented my tan, asked about my painting class. She treated me like a person with her own life and interests, rather than an extension of her family's needs. Now, sitting here on my balcony as the sun sets behind the mountains, I can honestly say that Samantha was wrong about one thing and right about another. She was wrong when she said no one would miss me if I disappeared. Emma and Lucas missed their grandmother. Derek missed his free childcare and household help. Even Samantha missed me, though it took her a while to figure out exactly what she was missing. But she was right that I had become someone who could disappear without much impact because I'd made myself so small, so invisible, so focused on serving others that I'd forgotten to be worth missing. The woman who left Ohio was a shadow of herself. The woman who lives in Arizona is someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth missing. Sometimes the cruelest words can become the greatest gifts. When Samantha told me no one would miss me, she accidentally showed me that I had stopped being a person worth missing. I had become so busy being needed that I forgot to be wanted. I learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's self-destruction disguised as sacrifice. I learned that it's possible to give too much to love, too much to sacrifice so much of yourself that there's nothing left worth having. But I also learned that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to rediscover your worth, to start over in a place where your presence is celebrated rather than tolerated. Now, 6 months later, sitting in my sunny apartment watching the desert bloom, I understand that disappearing was the only way to reappear. And the best part? People do miss me now because finally, there's a me worth missing. Sometimes you have to leave to learn your own worth, and sometimes the people who love you have to lose you to remember why they need you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between staying in a situation that was slowly killing your spirit and starting over somewhere new? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart or gave you something to think about, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear these words. And don't forget to subscribe, because I'll be sharing more stories about second chances, new beginnings, and the courage it takes to choose yourself when nobody else will. Thank you for listening to my story, for taking this journey with me from Ohio to Arizona, from disappearing to rediscovering myself. I hope you find the courage to value yourself as much as you value others. And remember that it's never too late to bloom where you're planted, even if you have to plant yourself somewhere new. May you always know your worth. May you always demand the respect you deserve. And may you never be afraid to start over when staying would mean losing yourself. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that you matter more than you know.